Thank you for starting your morning with us today. Our top story this hour, the NATO summit gets underway today, and the alliance's leaders are already making the headlines. Air Force One had not yet touched down in Brussels when the U.S. President Donald Trump took to Twitter to take a swipe at the European Union and his NATO allies. While the EU Council President Donald Tusk responded with a stinging rebuke, setting the stage for what are expected to be fractious talks. Evelyn Laverick has this story.
Air Force One makes a smooth landing in Brussels carrying the US president and his wife, but his allies in Europe are bracing themselves for a considerably bumpy ride at today's NATO summit. Even as Donald Trump was winging his way over the Atlantic, he hinted he might just ask for his money back if more members don't hit the alliance's target of spending 2% of GDP on defence. Before flying to Brussels as part of a 4-day trip to Europe, Trump raised the money issue, but there was also a twist in the tale.
We pay far too much and they pay far too little, but we will work it out. So I have NATO, I have the UK, which is in somewhat turmoil, and I have Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think? Who would think?
It's that relationship with the Russian president which is worrying some, and it provoked this warning.
Dear America, appreciate your allies. After all, you don't have that many. And dear Europe, spend more on your defense, because everyone respects an ally that is well prepared and equipped. Money is important, but genuine solidarity is even more important.
European NATO leaders are expecting Trump to lecture them for failing to increase defence spending, but the worry is he may go further. He could cancel US participation in one or more NATO exercises or delay the deployment of more troops and equipment to Europe. Trump could also, without any prior consultation with NATO allies, strike a deal with Vladimir Putin when he meets the Russian president next week. It's being billed as an unpredictable summit, but one thing is for sure, top of Trump's agenda is more commitment from allies to take on a bigger role and do more within the alliance. Evelyn Laverick, Euronews.
Our correspondent Brian Carter is following events closely from Brussels, and he's joining me now live. Brian, we've already seen a war of words, and it hasn't even begun. What can we expect today from the NATO summit?
Well, for starters, heavy security. Haven't seen this level of security in Brussels since the lockdown of 2015. According to the Belgian authorities, 2,500 policemen and 1,000 soldiers have been mobilized to ensure the security of this meeting, to ensure the security of the leaders. As you can see in this area behind me, that's where the leaders will have their dinner tonight. It's been closed to the public and there's heavy police presence everywhere. And just as Donald Trump disrupted the city traffic, he's expected, as you heard, to disrupt the official agenda, which is supposed to talk about cybersecurity, common defense, deterrence, etc. But the European leaders are bracing for the worst. They all remember the meeting here last year where he scolded them about defense spending, and everybody here is wondering if he could go further this time. We spoke with Thomas Valasek. He's a researcher at Carnegie Europe, and he's also the former representative of Slovakia to NATO. Take a listen.
Of 2018 is different from the Donald Trump of 2017. He's grown more comfortable in his skin. He is more willing to challenge the status quo, consequences be damned. He is less restrained by people around him. In fact, the new people around him, whether it's Mike Pompeo at the Department of State or John Bolton in the National Security Council, if anything, seem to be urging him, egging him on, rather than restraining him. So, the NATO heads and the ambassadors are braced for quite a tough summit.
Yeah, exactly. And you heard it as well before in the story. You heard the crucial issue here is money. The U.S. spends about $600 billion per year on defense. That's twice what the other members of NATO spend together. And Donald Trump has expressed his anger over this many times. There's a distinction here to be made, an important distinction. On the one hand, you have the budget for NATO, which is to ensure the day-to-day activities. And here all the members pay their fair share based on the calculation based on GDP, population, etc. But what Donald Trump is aiming at is the 2% target, which is a pledge that the allies made in 2014, that by 2024, they would reach 2% of GDP on defense spending. Now, only 8 members of NATO respect that target this year, and most members have increased the defense spending, but it's not going fast enough for Donald Trump. And now this 2% target is not just a symbolic target that it is easy to explain, but it also has an important value, as Thomas Valasek will explain right now.
The Allies don't spend 2% on building national forces. They are not going to have enough tanks, enough ships that NATO needs to put together in sort of a coherent force for its operations. So yes, the Allies can easily meet all of their commitments to the narrowly defined NATO defense budget. But that again just pays for basically the buildings. It pays for the electricity, the copy machines at the headquarters. It doesn't pay for the forces that allies put into operations. That comes out of the nationally spent defense budgets. That's why the 2% are important.
And of course, the fear here is that Donald Trump will use the troops here in Europe as a bargaining chip to force the other allies to spend more. There are roughly 60,000 U.S. men and women in uniform here in Europe. And if he decreases their number, that could destabilize the power forces here in Europe, destabilize the region. Now, some say that that fear is overblown. After all, Russia is not the USSR, and Russia's defense spending is lower than all the non-US NATO allies put together. But some say that if you look at Ukraine, if you look at Georgia, that indeed Russia is still a danger. And of course, knowing that Donald Trump will meet with Vladimir Putin next week in Helsinki, the big question is, what will they say, what will they decide, and will Vladimir Putin have the last word?
All right, thank you for that, Brian Carter. Big day ahead there in Brussels. Thanks. So how did President Trump and his NATO allies end up at this stage? Relations at the moment, it's not so friendly. Well, Alex has been following this story for us. Alex.
Not so friendly, Tessa, and there's a key moment many of you might remember from the last time we saw the NATO leaders gathering. Remember this moment? Donald Trump appearing to push past the Prime Minister of Montenegro. There you go. There goes the push. And then he adjusts his suit to go to the front of the group. This was during a tour of NATO's new headquarters. Now, whether he was pushing past him or helping himself through, people have debated this image to death on social media. Well, it's making a reappearance now, needless to say, because of the tone of discussions ahead of this latest NATO summit. Let's remind ourselves of what Donald Tusk is saying. Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, he has pinned this tweet to the top of his profile, and he's directed it directly at Donald Trump, saying, "Dear Donald Trump, the US doesn't have and won't have a better ally than the European Union." And in this tweet, he says that the money the EU countries are spending is on defense. But there's a thinly veiled threat here saying that Russia and China, their defense spending might not be so defensive. I mean, that's what people are reading into this tweet on social this morning. Also then ending it with this, we can have a look at this here. Rather strange thing to see at the end of a tweet like that, a smiley face. So, I mean, needless to say, the tone on social media is a little confusing with this discussion. Donald Trump being very clear, conflating, some say, discussions about trade with discussions about defence spending. Here saying the European Union expects the US to defend it, but it makes it impossible for farmers and businesses to work there. So there's a real tense war of words between allies here. And the New York Times, in an opinion piece, reminding people that on the campaign trail, Donald Trump described NATO as obsolete. Now, that is a phrase that we are seeing people pointing out and saying Donald Trump doesn't appear to be all that in favour of NATO ahead of this meeting. So who is the president going to this meeting? Is he the one who is wanting a strong, stable alliance, or is he the man who wants to describe the alliance as obsolete? Needless to say, division of opinion on social. Some people really standing up for America's strong stance. This is playing well among America's support base. Here saying, Trish saying the liberals are losing their minds just because America is asking people to pay their fair share. So needless to say, it's a divisive issue. What do you think? Is Donald Trump simply asking for people to pay their fair share, or is he out of line? You can let us know using #TheQ.
Thanks for that, Alex. I love how politicians are now all taking to Twitter to get their thoughts
Points
out.
across, absolutely.
Even before the NATO summit got underway, the alliance's leaders were making the headlines. Air Force One had not yet touched down in Brussels when the US President Donald Trump took to Twitter to take a swipe at the European Union and his NATO allies. Well, the EU Council President Donald Tusk, he responded with a stinging rebuke, setting the stage for what are expected to be fractious talks. NBC correspondent Hans Nichols sent this report from the White House.
What's clear from here at the White House as well as the Pentagon is that President Donald Trump is looking forward to a fight with NATO, what others might call allies, what President Trump says maybe freeloaders. When you look at the telegraphing the language from this White House as well as the Pentagon, it's clear that they don't like how little they think NATO is spending. The question about this summit on Wednesday is whether or not there will be a real fight or a fake fight. And when you look at some of the language coming out of Europe, especially the comments on Tuesday from Donald Tusk, it looks like the Europeans may actually gig Donald Trump into a real fight. What do I mean about a real fight? I mean a fight that has consequences, that maybe presses some people inside the Trump administration to give a better argument to Donald Trump on why he wants to withdraw from NATO. It will actually give him tangible and concrete arguments. So when you look at what's being considered, potentially drawing down troops from Germany, there's some talk about sending additional troops to Poland. These have real consequences. And inside the Trump administration, there's a great deal of frustration with the Europeans, and not just about how much they spend, but how much they contribute. Yes, they do contribute to the NATO mission, say, in Afghanistan, but not enough. And every time U.S. Secretaries of Defense go to NATO, to Brussels, whether or not it's this administration or the previous one, they never seem to be getting the kind of troop-level commitments that they want. Now, just over the weekend, there's a reminder here in the States how dangerous Afghanistan is. There's the third combat death of the year. But you go back to the previous friendly fire incident, so-called green on blue. Who actually died there? Romanian soldiers. So the challenge for Europeans is going to convince that Donald Trump that they do more than just how much they spend as a percentage of their GDP, but they're actually contributing to fights that matter for global security and U.S. security. But President Trump isn't necessarily willing to hear that argument, and there are people inside of his administration that have these isolationist tendencies. Secretary Mattis is not one of them, but there will be an internal fight within the U.S. administration on just how to make sure Donald Trump continues to abide by international commitments at NATO. Hans Nichols, NBC News for Euronews at the White House.